So hello everyone. So this is the last class of our course at the EPFL in Lausanne on the theory and history of the environment. It's a first year class welcoming in a way new students in architecture, including with these kinds of consideration, history and theory of the environment. And we are, of course, extremely happy to have David Holmgren with us for that last class. David is talking to us from, are you in Melbourne, David?
I am in Meliodora.
In Meliodora.
At home.
Okay. I thought you were at the convention, as you mentioned earlier.
I know that was recently in South Australia.
So David is at home in Meliodora, the place that he's been living like for 40 years almost now, and slowly managing and building, designing north of Melbourne. Thank you first, David, for being so kind to be with us today. What we plan is to have a conversation together, and feel free in the second half of that conversation to intervene and ask and participate into the conversation. Raphael will manage that. So David, the first, but what we plan to have is a conversation that will slowly focus on a big and important part of David's thinking, which is the scenario thinking. Which started to be addressed by him in a book in 2008. Probably it antedates that period, but the book in 2008, Future Scenario, like put the things on the table, and then evolved through a series of other essays and publications that we will evoke with him today until now, where when the situation of the pandemic particularly shed, in his view, new lights on all that. So, but David, maybe a first question, so that to make sure that everybody will have the same background to understand the following conversation. Could you tell our students who are about between 17 and 19-year-old here, what you were up to when you were the same age as they are?
Yes. Well, I completed high school in 1972, a year of tumultuous change, at least in Australia, where we had a shift from conservative government to the most radical reformist socialist government Australia's had, which lasted a few years before it was thrown out in a constitutional crisis. That was also the time of the first oil shock crisis in 1973, the year I spent hitchhiking around Australia trying to work out what I wanted to do, and came across a course called Environmental Design in Tasmania, which attracted all the radicals and dissidents from architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning courses around Australia to this course, which was pedagogically very radical in its framework. And I decided I wanted to study there. I had expressed an interest in architecture previously, and in joining that course I studied a lot of different things across a lot of different fields in the first generalist degree. And towards the end of that year, I met Bill Mollison accidentally, who was not in that faculty or even that institution. He was in the much older established University of Tasmania as a sort of a cantankerous dissident lecturer in what might be called some hybrid between sociobiology and environmental psychology. He was actually an ecologist who'd gone to university at a late stage. And I was interested in his ecological ideas. I actually never went to any of his lectures, but I was already, when I met him, interested in a whole lot of the ideas then of the counterculture, of self-reliance. And I was also at a stage in life, having been raised in a radical political activist family, of finding it difficult to how I could rebel against my very cool progressive parents. But in finding my own pathway, it was really towards, rather than fighting against all of the bad things happening in the world, just focusing on, we are going to actually create the world we want by living it each day. And I met Mollison, who was a generation older than me, and he had been at the front lines of the early environmental activism in Tasmania around quite a lot of issues, including some very famous ones to do with wilderness conservation. And he had come to somewhat the same conclusion. So the emergence of the permaculture thinking, which arose between us, was in that sort of, if you like, socio-political context, but especially the ideas of environmental crisis and the need for radically different ways of organizing society, which were being very widely debated.
And so it's during those years, like mid 70s, that you two interact and launch, in a way, what is going to be called by you permaculture. What does that mean, permaculture?
Yeah, permaculture is a design system for resilient and regenerative living and land use. So it's concerned with both the production side of the equation, how we provide our fundamental needs from a working relationship with nature, but it's also about the human behavioral, organizational, household, community, and ultimately economy and politics side that is necessary to make that whole. But it started really as a critique, a redesign of the most fundamental human activity on the planet, and the most problematic one, that of agriculture. And that this way that it's supported the huge explosion of population prior to the even larger explosion due to fossil fuel, and that the degradation of land that was accelerating under the effects of industrialized fossil fuel powered agriculture was the primary focus of permaculture, and that needed to be not just ameliorated or modified, but needed redesigned from first ecological principles. And
right.
We saw those ecological principles as being similarly relevant in an emergent way to the redesign of society.
Right. So permaculture is like is started in the field of land stewardship or agriculture, but as you describe it in the flower of permaculture, it concerns from there a whole series of other fields like technology, financing, everything there. Okay, but what was the? I think you once told me that Mollison, in a way, summed up at some point your discussion or your concerns by saying, what about taking the forest, the ecosystem of the forest, the climax as, yeah.
Well, this was the seed of the germination of the permaculture concept, and we were sitting around the fire discussing what I was going to get into in the second year of my studies, and he knew how radical and free environmental design was, and I could do anything. And I said, well, I'm interested in the intersection between primarily more landscape architecture than architecture in the biological realm, agriculture, and the underpinning science of ecology, and that I could see how two of those intersected in various theories and practices, but I couldn't see really anywhere where all three came together. And he thought about that for a while. And he said, that's very interesting. And he said, well, how about this for an idea then? He says, if most places on the planet, nature creates some sort of forest as the sort of optimal, energy efficient ecosystem to occupy the land, why doesn't our agriculture, if not look like a forest, at least function like a forest? And I said, that is perfect, a perfect point of focus, because it addressed the design issue, it addressed the fundamental of agriculture, and it looked at it from how do we use the principles and implicit design strategies of nature that we learn from ecology.
Okay, so that will lead to your writing bachelor thesis at age, what, 21 or something?
Yes, it was submitted when I was 21, and it was actually a case study, property design, quite simple and prosaic, but I used as the primary reference the then unpublished permaculture manuscript, which had only had a two-part series published in a magazine, in an organic farming magazine at that time in 1976. And then I left academia. I decided to not go on and do the postgraduate work and wanted to get my hands dirty in practical projects. And it was Mollison who was talking to not just his students, but really looking for a larger stage in the world than the University of Tasmania, of taking these ideas to the world. And so it was through his editing and edition and then seeking publication. And it was very interesting that as a result of radio interviews on Melbourne radio in 1977, 15 publishers approached us. I thought it was 6 from memory, but I then saw in a letter I wrote to my mother that it was 15 publishers approached this unknown and cantankerous academic and a completely unknown graduate student wanting to publish what became Permaculture 1. So I say to young people, what was going on in the world in 1977 for that to be the case? So obviously permaculture can't be separated from what was going on in the world at that time. This huge interest in these things between the two great oil crises that hit Western industrial society, 1973 and then 1979.
Yeah. So Permaculture 1, yes, is published in 1978, I think.
Yeah.
And Permaculture 1 is full of reference to all different fields, which you mentioned, partly landscape architecture, agronomy and agriculture, the history of agriculture, the books by agronomists from the early 20th century, which discuss the idea of permanent agriculture. Urbanists, I remember mentions of Kevin Lynch, of people like that. But it do seems to me that among the vastness of reference that you had, there were a few books that were particularly important and significant for you at that time. One, and the first one is probably The Limits to Growth. First report to the Club of Rome. And the second one, you'll tell me that there's plenty of probably others, but the second reference which lasted also in your work is Howard T. Odum, an ecologist, biologist. Could you, and his book, particularly Environment, Power and Society, which was published, if I remember well, just 1 year before The Limits to Growth in 1971. Could you say a few words about the importance of those two authors?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I think Limits to Growth encapsulated the environmental problem better than any other scientific report, certainly before and really even since. And I sort of regard it as much more significant than any of the IPCC climate change reports, in that it had a large systems overview of the human environment globe as a whole, rather than constructed from very complex modeling of all the detailed constituent bits, which is most of the things like the climate models, these enormously complex models. It was in some ways remarkably simple, but just working with that model was able to explore the possibilities of the attempts of course, continuous material growth on a finite planet, which is in any sort of rational, self-evident evaluation, obviously not possible. So that growth comes to an end at some stage, and what are the processes by which it came to an end? So I think that was very significant. Certainly the commissioners in the Club of Rome obviously were thinking some of these ideas well before that, and they recognized that the young people, Dana Meadows and colleagues, tutored by Jay Forrester at MIT, had that whole systems view that was very useful at sort of getting the big picture. So I think that was, apart from the enormous significance of the timing in 1972, then 1 year later, the first oil crisis, oil going from $5 a barrel to $40 a barrel as a result of the sanctions by the Saudis and others against the Western countries for supporting Israel, against the Arab countries in the Yom Kippur War, sort of highlighted how vulnerable modern society was to this critical resource. So I think that was incredibly important framing. And then I think Odum's work really was central for me in understanding, again, how to get past the limitations of reductionist science, which tried to understand everything from burrowing into the details, and in the complexity of understanding nature, understanding it in terms of energy flow, storage, dissipation, feedback loops, positive feedback loops, and the way he used an energy language to describe not only ecosystems, but also human cultural systems from hunter-gatherer to agricultural to industrial. And so it was a sort of a way of expanding systems ecology towards a much broader theory, by which we could use energy as a currency rather than money to evaluate, so to speak, apples and oranges, different things in the world, and try and understand them through a common language that was grounded in science rather than the artificial constructs of money and other human value systems.
Okay. So after your bachelor thesis, which eventually will become, or it became Permaculture 1, so you said while Mollison came out, published the book and kind of created the permaculture movement. So you went into experimenting these ideas. Could you tell us a few words about that period?
Yes, well, I started doing both practical work as both, if you like, an ecological garden farmer and also an ecological builder. And part of that was personal journey of building a practical skills base, because I was a very practical, hands-on sort of person. And also because I was trying to validate some of the things we'd talked about in theory. And it felt to me it was okay for Mollison in midlife, with all his diverse world experience, including, you know, a whole life before he ever went to university as a researcher, and before that a fisherman and a rabbit trapper and various other livelihoods. But I was very young and very inexperienced, so it felt invalid for me to sort of project these ideas into the world compared with ground truthing them. And at the same time, I was involved in various projects where people were trying to live more sustainably, more self-sufficiency, and how to do that without using toxic chemicals and excessive technology, doing that in ways that are simple and accessible and more in harmony with nature. And I developed several properties, one of those with my mother on the far south coast of New South Wales, built a passive solar house, and in the process became a passive solar evangelist of, you know, how incredibly good passive solar worked, at least in southern Australian climates. And also developed a whole further interest in ecological forestry. And so not just the sort of food production side of permaculture, but how we manage timber and fiber forests for providing material needs. So that interest from forest management right through to building as a woodworker was an intense personal interest. But in that process, I was training myself for the work of being a permaculture design consultant, where in the practical realities of the marketplace, going out and advising people who had bought a piece of land, okay, where do we put the house? Where are the roads, the water supply systems, whole land use design, often in a very short, limited budget template to guide and inform what people would otherwise just do themselves, learning along the way. So that was the basis of my consultancy business, Holmgren Design, that I set up in 1983. And so that design work, and then involved in the practical projects that informed that, yeah, occupied me a lot, including here at Meliodora from the mid-80s on.
I'll share a few, 3 or 4 images of Meliodora here. Can you see it, Rafael? My screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to show the book that you published, I think there are 2 editions of it, of Meliodora, so the place that you've been developing for now 40 years, almost. It's a wonderful, actually, publication. This book, very precise on every aspect of the management of that land, and you still live there. You're talking to us from there. Okay. Now, in 2002, I think you published a book which probably must be considered as the kind of most developed theoretical work about permaculture, the theory of permaculture, with like centering on the three ethical principles and the 12 design principles of permaculture. We cannot go into all this, of course, just here, but maybe could you comment on those two things that I'm going to show here. Sorry. Vous voyez là l'écran?
Yeah, so yes, the framework of principles which emerged from me being invited by permaculture teachers who had received the lineage of permaculture design teaching from Mollison over the period of the 80s. I was an observer of that process, and then I became involved in teaching on these permaculture design courses. And the permaculture design course operating outside of academia was, in fact, the most fundamental building block of course, the movement of permaculture around the world. And in teaching during the 90s, I sort of took that initial framework that had emerged from Mollison's teaching, which itself had emerged from our early ideas and been clarified to some extent in his master work, the Permaculture Designer's Manual, published in '88, and then gradually started to work that through my own understandings. And over that period of the 90s, came to this distillation of the three core ethics, which were sort of really a common statement across permaculture teaching, and this framework of 12 design principles. And so that formed the structure of a chapter each in Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which I think revitalized a lot of permaculture design and teaching and activism around the world, because people had this strong understanding that permaculture was not just gardening and agriculture, but trying to sort of frame its fundamental principles in enough generalized enough way than them not being seen to be just confined to that territory had been problematic, I suppose. And so a lot of experienced permaculture people took this framework and said, this is really useful in our understandings. And it then also attracted interest from other thinkers who were not involved in the practicalities of agriculture, gardening, ecological building, to look more closely at permaculture as a serious framework for the redesign of society around ecological principles. I suppose the second, and of course we used these icons as memory tools, but also trying to distill the principle down to a very simple but universal message as a counterpoint to the acknowledgement that the strategies and techniques in permaculture are incredibly diverse and different depending on the environmental and the people context. So rather than permaculture being a recipe of swales and herb spirals and food forests and particular strategies and techniques, it was more this fundamental challenge to our ways of thinking. And we saw that the principles emerge from this domain of land and nature stewardship, which is the working relationship with nature, where we understand intimately what are nature's design rules that we then apply to the built environment, tools and technology. And a lot of people saw those three domains as, oh, that's what permaculture is. But implicit and explicit in some permaculture teaching, even before principles and pathways, were these other four domains that often were called the invisible structures of permaculture, involving education and culture, health and spiritual well-being, finance and economics, land tenure and community governance. And that obviously for an ecologically sustainable and just society, you actually had to have redesign of all of those. And it was also interesting that different people were coming to permaculture not just through these the biological and these built domains, but for example, those involved in complementary medicine, different aspects of spiritual journeys were finding a path into this ecological framework through these other domains. Obviously, permaculture is still in its practice concentrated in particular areas, but this book certainly tried to broaden that focus out. And I think that's been a process that has continued in the permaculture movement, obviously drawing in ideas from kindred concepts and movements and practices around the world. And in that poster, some of the list of things that are listed there are things that might not have been uniquely or even specially associated with permaculture, but reflect the design principles and the ethics.
Yeah. Before we move to future scenario and the scenario thinking, I just wanted to evoke that other major publication that was issued in 2018, if I remember well. It's a huge book, actually structured around the flower of permaculture. That is very, in a way, site or region specific, looking at the Australian suburbs around Melbourne, the place where you are, where you live. Could you say a few words about that book? You say it's your most ambitious book ever, while it's very, very site specific.
Yes, well, it distills. It's really three books: the built, the biological, and the behavioural. Which is the behavioural is summarising at a household scale all of those other domains of the permaculture flower, and it is unashamedly localist as a counterpoint to globalization and a counterpoint to the publishing industry, which always wants to generalize books so everyone will think it's perfectly relevant to them. Whereas this is saying, no, this is located here and people elsewhere will need to interpret and adapt the ideas. And so that was sort of quite deliberate aspect, but it was also informed by the energy descent thinking that was implicit in the whole lineage of permaculture, that the changes that were coming rapidly through crisis would be so fast that we would never have the opportunity to redesign human habitation, our large cities, our large landscapes along ecological principles before the limits to growth crisis sort of constricted the opportunities to do so. And that in that context, the retrofitting paradigm rather than greenfields architectural and landscape architectural and urban planning design would be the cutting edge of how humans would adapt in situ to very different worlds. So although it's very practical and focused on what residents can do themselves rather than at the policy level, the strategic thinking is very much informed by those larger patterns.
Okay. So now we move to future scenarios, which was published in 2008. And could you say in your own words, describe a bit this central scheme that you published in that book, which I think is extremely enlightening to analyze the situation today. Could you describe for us that drawing?
Yes, well, the context for this is that my work from the beginning, as a result of the limits to growth, was informed by some view of the future being a form of energy descent, that the net energy available to support humanity would contract. And as a result of that, everything would be restructured in one way or another, rather than it being some sort of ideological choice or whatever. All of those ideological, cultural, and ways of living would be forced to change as a result of that contraction rather than the constant expansion of energy. So this energy basis of Odum, that is the primary driver of systems in collective form, was central to that. And in trying to understand the diversity of how energy descent might emerge, I thought that was very important to sort of try and work with that for a number of reasons. Firstly, I'd observed that almost all thinking about the future tended to be focused on what I called a techno-explosion future, greater energy, greater control over nature, all sorts of different forms of that. And then there was a counterpoint to that of extreme collapse or the end of the world sort of view. And there was very little in the middle of what happens with a sort of more gradual but continuous contraction. Even though we have a lot of historical evidence of such things like the Roman Empire, for example, which was that pattern. So that's the sort of precursor to trying to understand what the primary drivers were and uncertainties in what might shape different future scenarios of energy descent. And I came to the conclusion that the decline in the primary high quality fossil fuel energy in the form of conventional oil and its uncertainty about when it would peak and at what rate it would decline was a big uncertainty. And that the other driver, which is obviously closely related to fossil fuel, is the rate and severity in the onset of climate change. So rather than that being a certainty as a result of all the complex modeling and science, still huge amounts of uncertainty about whether that would be relatively benign and slow in its onset or more extreme and rapid. And that then created 4 combinations. So these are obviously in classic scenario planning language. These are not choices we make. These are situations that emerge beyond our control, and whether we're thinking about that as individuals or as communities or nation states even, that although both of these are affected by human activity, the outcomes are not really something we have necessarily direct control over, but they are influenced by what humans might do. And so in that, I saw the two left scenarios, green tech and brown tech, were less severe or extreme. And the other two, Earth Steward and Lifeboat, were more extreme. And I suppose the element in trying to describe the characteristics that would emerge, I was suggesting that the sort of organizational structures that would emerge would actually reflect the energy base. For example, in the green tech scenario, with a net reduction of energy, but it being slow from the fossil side, and the climate being relatively benign, that agriculture and forestry and other aspects by which humans gained their needs from nature would continue to more or less work. But because total energy is contracting, the relative importance of agriculture and forestry and fishing and all of these different ways would be larger, whereas they've been very small in a world dominated by fossil fuel. So that would mean that, again, these energy sources from nature in agriculture and forestry are distributed across landscape, whereas fossil resources are concentrated in holes in the ground, as are also the mineral ore bodies that need to go with that as energy sources. And as in the photo, the renewable energies that would be developed in response to that declining energy from fossil fuel and the climate imperative are themselves also distributed rather than concentrated, and that would lead to economic development that was more distributed than our current city-centric concentration, and that through that, politics and economy would actually reflect that energetic structure with relatively harsh economic conditions in a lot of cities, and in a lot of rural environments, those who controlled those distributed resources, even if still going through some sort of energy descent, would be relatively more affluent or powerful. So that would create a regional centric economic and governance structure. So that's an example of how that basic energetic structure would affect what we mostly think of as being a product of different ideologies or different human values that come to the fore.
David, we are going to take a 15-minute break. It's the rule.
Yeah.
EPFL.
Yes, good idea.
A 15-minute break, and then we will continue. Okay?
Yep.
So
Very good.
see you in a quarter of an hour.
Yep.
So we restart our conversation with this diagram, which is here. And in a way, it understands, it helps us understand, I think, what you started saying when describing the originality and compass of the Club of Rome's, the Limits to Growth report. Because you could say that we have two today, I think, intergovernmental panels on climate, on biodiversity, and they are both of them investigating the vertical arrow, or specific dimensions of the vertical arrow here, which could be, I think, globally described as the progressive degradation of the conditions of life on the planet, either slow or fast. But the Limits to Growth report combined that first arrow, which was called pollution, basically, in one of the big variables of the model, with at least another huge one, which is non-renewable resources, be they energetic or material, metals, rare earth. And in a way, this horizontal arrow could be, I think, described as the power that humans have at their disposal to transform the world, adapt it, including to the consequences of the other one, etc. So in a way, it is, yes, crossing those two things. We don't have any, I think we have an international energy agency, but we don't have anything like these huge political international efforts, put intergovernmental panel, or you name it, that would investigate these non-renewable resources and make scenarios in the future. Do we have that, David?
Oh, well, the main problem is that there's not an intellectual scientific basis for measuring and evaluating both non-renewable and renewable resources in the amount of net energy that they provide to support humanity's so far rising complexity. Mm-hmm. Because that complexity, and whether we see that in terms of the internet or many, many other manifestations of complexity, all require more net energy. So our ability to control and manipulate nature, to manage all of the problems of ecological overshoot, all require more energy. And of course, economists have no structural framework for dealing with that. And in terms of ecological energetics, it's been a tiny field until fairly recently. And within that field, there was a tragedy really in the early 80s where those using what I believe was the most sophisticated methodology, that of Howard Odum, sort of lost the conceptual fight over how to measure net energy. So that what I predicted in the 90s is that once we hit global oil peak and the climate crisis, there would be this substantial intellectual confusion and fight about what was the net energy return of different sources of energy, including modern renewables. So that battle is going on, but it's a battle of theory in attempt to predict what will happen in the larger term. So this occurs in relation to, is the 100% renewable energy substitution for fossil fuels technically possible, practically implementable in a timeline that can address the climate crisis? And is it then sustainable in the long term? Or is it just a flourish expression of fossil fuel wealth in itself, of embodied fossil fuel wealth? So there is debate around these things, but it's so confused and in such a difficult context of invested interests, who have deep commitment, not just on the fossil fuel side, but increasingly on the huge renewable energies, where people are very ideologically committed that they can project this pathway of growth and transformation without the need for massive reduction, without the need for simplification. what Nat Hagens calls the great simplification that's coming if you don't have the net energy.
In a subsequent essay to Future Scenario, which was published, I think, a couple of years after on your site, and is called Money versus Fossil Energy, you deepened away your thinking about that and insisted a lot. You basically explained that there is two opinions or ideology about what is the source of wealth and development. You could say on the one side, the realists and materialists who think that the origin of wealth is actually in the ground, the physiocrats in a way, fossil energy stuff, etc. And the others who are maybe more numerous today, who think that it's human genius, human capacity to, let's say, overcome the apparent limits of things. Could you elaborate a bit on that? And you're actually saying that it's, in your view, even more important than the difference of ideologies between collectivists and right and left in a way. Could you tell us that? This is what this little diagram that you published in that essay summarizes.
Yes, I'm not sort of minimizing the importance of this very significant ideological divide about the individual versus the collective, and this tension that has existed in all human societies about the needs of the collective and the needs of the individual that we can think of as a simple left-right political spectrum in some form or other. But this other idea that two ideas about the sources of wealth being nature and not just fossil resources, but in fact the precursors to that in fertile land, forests, the resources of renewable nature, so that for example, the feudal lords were connected enough to their environment that they understood their wealth and power wasn't just from their political cunning or how smart they were, but how much food their peasants could produce and how much good timber there was in their forests. They understood that, but then mercantile elites, with the development of capitalism and further removal from their sources of sustenance and power, became more focused on human creativity as a source of wealth. And we can think of this, the emergence of the Enlightenment ideas and certainly of capitalism, and for that matter of socialism too, that humans actually create wealth. And the pinnacle of all the different groups that believed in this were those who believed that money was the masterful human creation that created wealth. So we can see how there is some truth in both of these views, and the seed of that is in permaculture as well, in Mollison's emphasis on the yield is only limited by the imagination, whereas my tendency to focus on the idea that there's no free lunch, that everything depends on some energetic possibility to come about. So the interplay between these in the creation of our world, between the miners, the engineers, and the military people who sought to control the important holes in the ground that provided wealth, and then the bankers and the diplomats and the social justice advocates, but most centrally the bankers who managed that ultimate masterful creation of money, that magic of money, that those two sides of our civilization worked in unity together, even though they had very different views of what was the source of wealth. And that gradually, as the civilization is reaching its limits, they are now more fighting each other. And so I was seeing in that essay this battle epitomized in the big energy companies and the big energy nations like Russia and Saudi Arabia, pitted against the huge banks and the IMF and these organizational structures that were actually more favorable to the climate agenda, that they thought that through this huge creativity, we could overcome those limits. And so I saw that, you know, that is a sort of a political battle that was going on within our nations and within the world.
Yeah. Then in 2014, you issued another essay called, that was much debated everywhere, called Crash on Demand. Welcome to the brown tech, in which you, the first thing is that you identified clearly the brown tech scenario, which combines still a lot of power available and dramatic consequences of the degradation of the conditions of life, as being the scenarios that was kind of emerging in your view. Could you tell us why?
Yes, well, firstly, the evidence on the rate of onset of climate change was strengthening, and the emission of greenhouse gases was still accelerating despite all the talk and significant action. And in addition to that, there was more evidence that the high price rises of oil in the post-2000 period had triggered a massive investment in more hard to get lower quality unconventional oil resources that promised to slow the trajectory of net energy decline post-peak, combined with the early development of renewable energy, which I saw as largely embodied fossil fuel energy, was going to sort of moderate that decline. So in that sort of situation, that is the essence of the brown tech scenario. But what then, to understand what characterizes the brown tech scenario in a sort of a psychosocial political sense, is that it's characterized by a lot of crises. Because firstly, there's the jockeying between geopolitical powers which have not collapsed over who controls what resources. And so that intensifies. And that leads to all sorts of crises, such as we're experiencing now with Ukraine and whatever. And also the climate change generates weather disasters and other natural crises. And in that situation, there's a loss of faith in market solutions and a demand for governments to become strong actors in a sort of like a war type situation to implement rapid changes. And so that led to me to suggest early on when I characterized the brown tech scenario, that this would be characterized by a command economy where governments and international agencies would start doing things in response to those crises. And that further than that, they would lack a lot of the technical expertise and infrastructure to do that because they've relied so much on markets controlled by corporations. And so there would be a partnership between stronger central government and corporations to achieve whatever these objectives or outcomes, or at least respond to these. But inevitably, a lot of those would actually themselves accelerate resource consumption and accelerate greenhouse gas emissions and actually make the problem of the climate worse.
Yeah.
So that was how I was seeing the situation, and that further that you start to armor the current system to make it more resistant to all of these shocks and stresses. But in that armoring, you reduce resilience.
Mm-hmm.
You make it initially strong, and you start to have focus that tries to focus on ensuring resources are available in the centers of power, like in cities, but you progressively abandon the hinterlands. So that was the dynamic that I saw as already signs of it unfolding in 2010, 2013. And I thought that was a sort of a bad prognosis for humanity. And in a sense, the essay I thought was controversial for saying we're in the brown tech scenario, but many other people saw it because I flagged this idea that maybe if some proportion of the global middle class said withdrew their work, their consumption, and their investment from the system, it would actually lead to a financial collapse, which would force a downscaling of the system and avert this extreme climate problem. And of course, many people saw that as very extreme or unethical. I wasn't really advocating that sort of top-down response. I was saying to burnt out climate activists, look, actually, we're having more positive experience in the permaculture world, trying to build the parallel world, the positive world. We don't know whether this will work, but come and join us, and possibly that might have, if enough people did that, they would still have this agency to actually bring about this larger scale change. But I'm personally not necessarily in that world of this desperate psychological belief that we must have agency over our destiny. But I can see how huge numbers of people, that's essential to their ability to function, the belief that we have agency and control over our destiny.
Mm-hmm. Was it into money versus fossil energy, or in that essay, Crash on Demand, that you developed what you already explained in Future Scenario, that even if these scenarios are defined by very different situations, which the diagram sum up, that they are not necessarily exclusive from one another?
Yeah.
First, because the world is not one; there is many different situations, and second, because also within each society, they could be like Russian puppets. So, could you explain why this is possible?
Yeah. So, as was shown in that nested diagram of one scenario within another, the larger brown tech scenario is a natural response if you think of nation states or global corporations. A lot of the strategies that would make sense or reflect that scenario are appropriate to that scale of energetic power. Whereas if you are working at, say, a city government level, thinking about the future, then a lot of the strategies that become emergent in the green tech scenario are actually central to your work. If you are a community or permaculture activist trying to do appropriate solutions with food gardens and community-supported agriculture, a lot of those things reflect the Earth Steward scenario. And if you are at home with your partner thinking about where will our food come from, will our children be safe, then those strategies really reflect the lifeboat scenario. So in this sense, differences of energetic scale can be simultaneously happening. And of course, people might be thinking about the lifeboats at home, but they have a paid job in mainstream sustainability, trying to implement some of the things that are emblematic of green tech. So apart from the difference from one place, one geography to another, and how those differences could become greater as the world deglobalizes, this idea that all of these scenarios are in some ways nested. I think many people found this insightful to a way of understanding these different worlds that we inhabit. And it takes it away from the idea that one is good and the other is bad, or as a result of stupid actors that doing things where governments are doing something that actually makes the problem worse. So that reaction to crises that are characteristic of the brown tech has a lot of built-in things that become effectively disaster capitalism, where you make money from dysfunction, or power grows from the more things fall apart. You know, that rather than these things being a result primarily of evil or stupid people.
In the recent year, with the pandemic, during the pandemic, and the governmental responses that were given to that situation, you wrote a lot of important essays. Could you say what the experience of the pandemic, what lessons you drew from that period?
Yes, well, I mean, it's obviously a very complex thing, and something that's been very difficult for any discussions, debates to sort of really be had, because of we are still in this world of no, we won't go there, we don't need to look, or it's all understood and proven. And that debate is a bad thing because it allows unhelpful or serious misinformation to paralyze society. So that misinformation is like now a virus that must be fought at all costs. So that is a difficult context, but in terms of my future scenarios work, what I tried to do was to show how the response of governments was very much part of a command economy. This is what a command economy looks like. You know, the government says this and that stops, and this, we cut that and we focus resources on this. That's what it looks like. And there's a great appeal to a collectivist, this must be done for the state of the nation, for the state of the world, for the good of the whole. And we also see that the partnership with corporations, where they make money from the disaster, and the bigger the disaster is, they make even more money. At the same time that a lot of the discretionary economy run by small business actually sort of goes through a partial collapse. So in that sense, that also leads to two stories that I had already articulated strongly in all of the work on future scenarios, that in this brown text scenario, decisions come towards us and there are primarily two choices. One is come into the system and we will provide you with security, but you need to climb into a narrower straitjacket. And I characterize that of people leaving areas in Australia that might be subject to bushfire and coming into the city where governments say they could protect people. Versus you can have the freedom and be outside the system, but you don't have any of the benefits of the system and you will be largely on your own. And that in this situation, most people would choose the first option, but some people on what might be just a small turning point choose the other option and then find themselves on opposite sides of a widening gulf in society where there's a minority of people out in what I call the feral fringes, surviving on their own food production, farmers markets and community supported agriculture. And then most people are in the system with their identity card access to the centralized food system. So that's the way I characterized it long before COVID would be an example in some sort of crisis. And of course, the vaccination mandates actually created this divided class. And naturally enough, most people, some of them enthusiastically and some reluctantly, chose the security and the greater enclosure, and a small proportion said no and suffered some disadvantage or exclusion. And many of those, of course, were driven to accelerate their development of self-reliant systems, parallel community, parallel economy. So in a sense, that was a condensation or a sort of an example of what I see happening on a larger scale as the climate emergency gets worse. The government will say, well, finally, we have to do X, Y, and Z. We have to close these parts of the economy. We have to do this. And this is for the common good. And there will be some who will, in some way, resist that because they don't believe in that, or all sorts of different reasons, and they will find themselves building some sort of parallel economy. So in that sense, I see the response to the pandemic, and it doesn't matter whether that's a real natural disease from nature or whether it's a lab leak, and it doesn't matter how much of this is a construction and a plan and how much of it is self-organized response. It's actually very representative of the brown text scenario.
So a confirmation of the brown text scenario really.
Yes, I'm much more certain that we are in the brown text scenario.
Okay. So maybe it's time to open up the discussion to the students. Thank you very much for accepting to do this little promenade within your own scenario thinking. Rafael, do we have?
Yeah, we have one comment from Aristide.
Yeah.
That showed us that it actually exists an international resource panel. He puts the link in the description. So maybe Aristide, if you want to. If you're still, yeah.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was just a reaction when you were mentioning about whether such an instance exists. It exists, albeit it does not fulfill the role that you suggested. It is looking and monitoring and doing an outlook on resources, but is not in depth enough of asking these critical questions. Do we have enough? What are the trade-offs, et cetera, et cetera?
or making scenarios about the use. Okay.
One other comment I would make there is that the king resource of oil, and especially conventional oil, in theory, we actually have a lot of knowledge. Petroleum geologists are incredibly good at understanding what the potential of different resource, untapped resources are before they do so. But the resources of the big producing countries have been national secrets. So we don't have actually public access to that, though I'm sure organizations like the CIA and others actually do for countries like Saudi Arabia and others. So there's an example of something that petroleum resources, the understanding, the technical understanding was way better than our understanding of climate change, but we didn't actually have the numbers. So therefore there was these huge uncertainties about these, but those numbers do exist.
And then we have another question from Paul-Emmanuel Loiret.
Paul, tu veux?
Hello, thank you to Sébastien to inviting me. I'm architect and architectural professor in an architecture school in Paris. And very interested in your work and in the relationship between architecture and agriculture. I have two little questions. In France and in other countries, the nuclear scenario is very important, and the discourse is to say that the nuclear possibility can go beyond the brown tech scenario, and what about that in your reflection? And also, do you think there is a clear relation between technology and energy? Can technology be less? Can consume less energy if it's developed? It's the discourse of all the technologist people, so it's a very important point, I think, in this discussion.
Yes, well, taking that second question first, the technology I see as largely is a product of energy density and reliability and availability. That technology, every step in technological growth has been on the back of adding further energy sources. And none of those energy sources that we've added, from coal to oil to natural gas, hydro and nuclear, and now modern renewables, have done anything much to take away the prior use of energy in biomass and animal power. Some very small declines in those, but basically each layer has added, nothing has substituted. But that has built a greater complexity in technology, and then those technologies have allowed some substantial efficiency gains in each translation of energy into useful services. And those initially, there are very large gains from that technology, like the huge improvements in steam power that happened, or the huge improvements in photovoltaics that happened. But the general idea that you can get this runaway improvement in technology, most evidence is you get this mature technology effect and you reach a thermodynamic limit, which is actually characteristic of the fundamental physics that can't be improved upon. And similarly, in natural evolution, things like the conversion of solar energy to plant carbohydrate, the idea that some novel pathway could come about that could suddenly double photosynthetic efficiency after thousands of millions of years of evolution seems highly unlikely. So most of the claims of these sorts of gains don't necessarily add up when properly evaluated, because the complex ways in which already embodied energy is subsidizing those things. I suppose the issue of nuclear, of course, is an example of very complex technology that I think is actually emblematic of the brown tech, where resources will be spent to armor the energy systems, and that it's quite likely that nuclear will be part of that. But the idea that that will generate a net energy gain that can push back the problems of ecological overshoot, the financial crisis collapse of massive debt, the geopolitical and other conflicts, and the psychosocial debt that is a product of generations of affluence. So all of these multiple layers of debt have to be dealt with, as well as deal with rapid depletion of non-renewable resources and deal with the climate problem. So that I don't think that any prospective application of nuclear in any foreseeable scenario can overcome all of those things. And I think there's, of course, I've written an essay recently on the new interest there is in fusion power. And I hadn't looked at that subject for 30 years, but I did go back into it after the technical breakthroughs that have happened in laser-based fusion power. And I still think that is largely, sort of put simply, hype. But I'm pretty convinced that nuclear in some form is going to go through some sort of a renaissance, but it will be part of a brown tech world where we end up with a bigger energy industry taking more of society's resources. And that is actually a sign of energy descent, because a bigger energy industry means there's less net energy available for society to do all the other things it does. But it will look like very good for the people involved in that industry, whether they're building wind turbines or whether they're building nuclear power stations.
Rafael?
We have question here, but microphone is not working, so they have to move to the computer.
Okay.
It's a walking conference.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello. Yeah.
So the question I have is that, as you told us, the 4 scenarios are not independent each from another. So knowing that brown tech is the most instinctive reaction that countries that are developed can have, and knowing that it wants to have control over the people and the situation, and knowing that, as you said, most people would choose to follow what security is, but knowing that it will just collapse, is it possible to have like I see these 4 scenario more like 4 stages of what one scenario could be, but it is possible to have to live in like the 4th scenario or the 2 last scenarios where there is no state that controls, but
yeah, I think I understand your point there.
Maybe en anglais.
Mais en français. We try it in French.
En gros, il y a, je voyais en fait ces différents scénarios comme une continuité où d'abord il y a le brown tech qui serait plus le choix des États.
Ouais.
Ensuite, le green tech qui serait plus un choix des villes, tout simplement, des cités. Ensuite, le earth stewards qui serait comme pour des communautés plus... Voilà, une continuité d'échelle.
Comme le schéma qu'il a montré.
Voilà, et sachant que l'humain dans ce genre de situation se dirigerait forcément vers là où il y a le plus de sécurité, donc là où il y a le plus de contrôle, donc là où il y a plus de pouvoir, mais que ce système viendrait à s'épuiser, est-ce que ce ne serait pas plutôt un seul scénario qui montrerait en fait les différentes étapes de la destruction qui mènerait en fait tout simplement à une situation où on est tous un peu en train de survivre et se taper dessus?
Yeah. David, you seem to understood French. Do you want me to translate?
I think it would be good for you to summarize.
So the question that you talk about the 4 scenarios in scale continuity, but is it not also a time continuity as it's a different phase of destruction of our society? And even if individual wants to go to the more secure scenarios, at the end, with the depletion of resources, we will end in the last lifeboat scenarios.
Yes, that's correct. That the idea I put in the later future scenarios work and told in a story about our own region from the perspective of 2086 was a 2-stage crisis, the current crises that we're entering. And in that story, the world moved into a green tech scenario, which was more or less stable, at least in our region, for some decades. And then there was another crisis in the 2060s that led to the sort of full end of globalization and a bioregional economy emerging, which was an Earth steward scenario. So that was a relatively benign energy descent pathway through 2 still severe crises and then stabilizations. My argument is that brown tech, by its armoring of the system and the positive feedbacks that further accelerate resource depletion, it tends to lead to the lifeboat scenario directly, but after some period probably of stabilization rather than a continuous spiraling down. But within that brown tech, the other parts of those scenarios are working in the shadows as well. So for example, the 15 or 20 or 30% of people who in different societies choose to be outside the system will go through a schizophrenic process about wanting to enclose everyone within the system because they are important consumers and often important workers to maintain the system. But another aspect of the system will be trying to push people away to look after themselves to reduce the stresses on the system. For example, stresses on the health system. If people go and look after themselves with alternative therapies, then that allows the system to sort of keep going. So there's this tension in the system between it trying to enclose people fully and demonize those who stay outside it, and other parts of it which will be encouraging people to look after themselves. And in addition to that, the progressive decline in central power, it will not be able to control people outside the system. So in that sense, as the power shrinks, there's these increasingly wild or feral spaces or alternative spaces where people are building parallel societies at the fringe in some way. And that's both in a geographic fringe, but also in a conceptual fringe. So that's sort of two layers. There's, as you said, that sequential likelihood of further declines, that the armoring of the system doesn't sort of overcome the problem of resource depletion, and especially if it tends to feed back and continue the climate problem continuing to get worse.
Thanks. Sebastian, you have to sum up because it's 10 and we have to leave the room.
Yeah, we have to leave the room. There is another class.
My answers have been people.
Thank you very much, David, for your time and intelligence and for sharing all these thoughts with us. So thank you. See you soon, I hope, either virtually or maybe one day. Really, if we move the exhibition to Australia, that would be great.
Yeah.
And thank you to all the students. See you soon, and take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Mm.